Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. Coming up, we're going to talk about school choice, the latest school choice efforts across the country, and it's super encouraging to see. So hopefully your state is on the list of states that are starting to move much closer to vouchers. But first, I want to talk about how things are getting crazier and crazier in this world, and I want to bring some peace, because that out of control feeling that you probably feel is because we try to fix things that are way up here, right? And way over here, and things that are out of our reach and out of our control. And the way to not only feel better, but to actually make a difference is to focus on what you can control. So I want to talk about that in this segment. Also, I want to thank you for making this show a part of your daily inputs, because you are bombarded, right? People are desperately crying and screaming and begging for your attention. And the fact that you choose here right now means a lot to me, and I don't want to take that ever for granted. I'd argue that there's nothing more important than what you choose to consume in your life. So thank you for actively choosing this. First, let's start with a Confucius quote, because if I quote Jesus all the time, then people write me emails, they say, oh, Slater hurt my feelings with all his Bible references. Oh. People can't take it. So I got to sprinkle in some Stoicism and Confucius and stuff like that. So Confucius, 500 BC, China. Actually, this is from Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound's one of his translators, writing about Confucius in 1927. But he made the point that the ancients, they wanted a perfectly running empire, obviously, right? They knew that before that, they needed well-run state, local governments. So to get that, first they needed to, in his words, establish order in their own families. Now, before they could get order in their own families, they needed to have self-discipline. And in order to get self-discipline, they needed to, in his words, rectify their hearts. Rectify, in this case, set right, but also has a connotation of purify. You need to purify your hearts. But in order to rectify your heart, you need to first seek out precise verbal definitions of your inarticulate thoughts. Seek out precise verbal definitions of your inarticulate thoughts. Right? That needs to be the thing. To me, that's curating your inputs. Right? What are your inputs? Because that changes your thoughts. And once you can properly define your thoughts and properly control them, then your heart can be purified, and then you can have self-control, and then you can get your family in order, and then your neighborhood will be improved, and then the country will run well. But it starts with your inputs and yourself. It's the same thing Jordan Peterson says, right? Rule, I think 6, get your house in order before you criticize the world. Right? We so badly want to fix the world, fix government, but no one wants to do the work first on themselves, and then on their own families. But even before that, being precise with your language, being precise with your thoughts, being precise with your inputs. So watch what you're consuming. That's my theme of the year. For me, that's like I need to watch what I consume. And I'm grateful that you've chosen to be here. I want to quote Sam Altman. He said, minimize your cognitive load from distracting things that don't really matter. It's hard to overstate how important this is and how bad most people are at it. Get rid of distractions in your life. Develop very strong ways to avoid letting crap you don't like pile up and take your mental cycles away, especially in your work life, but it's in everything. So get rid of distractions so you can focus really on what matters. Let me share a dramatic analogy here. Let me share one of my favorite stories, and then we'll make an analogy out of it. Alexander the Great. Right? So Alexander the Great, he conquered the Persian Empire, and then he moved his way into India. Present-day Pakistan, but they called it India back then. So this was 325 BC. Okay, so they're in India. And Alexander and his men, they come across these people they've never seen before. They call them gymnosophists, or gymnosophists. So gymno, it's where we get the word gymnasium. It means naked, right? Back in ancient Greece, if you went to the gymnasium, you did all your athletic naked, right? So naked. And sophists meant wise men. So these were the naked wise men, gymnosophists. Yogis, yogis in India. These yogis, they had nothing. They had nothing. They spent their entire lives in poverty, in deep contemplation and stillness. They owned nothing. They had a loincloth and a begging bowl. And that's it. And they would congregate in the sun along the banks of rivers. It's the first time Alexander and his men have ever seen these crazy people. So one day, Alexander and his men, they were looking to pass along a river, and there were a bunch of these silly yogis in the way meditating. So one of Alexander's men, he rushes ahead, and he tells the yogis to leave, get out of the way. And the yogi, one of the yogis in particular, he says, no, I'm not leaving. We have as much of a right to be here to this space as anyone else. So Alexander sees what's going on, and Alexander approaches the yogis. And I'm at the yogi. I imagine this one yogi, he's sitting cross-legged, right? He's doing that thing. And Alexander's man, he says, don't you know who this man is? Pointing to Alexander the Great. Don't you know who this man is? This man has conquered the world. What have you done? And I imagine the yogi not even looking up, right? The yogi's just sitting here like this, right? The guy's yelling at him, like, do you even know who this is? This man's conquered the world. What have you done? And the man he's not even like I'm thinking like Mr. Miyagi, right? You know, Mr. Miyagi, he's doing his thing, and then Daniel's son walks in, and Mr. Miyagi says, hello, Daniel's son. He doesn't even, right? That's what I mean. This man's conquered the world. What have you done? And the yogi says, I have conquered the need to conquer the world. All right, is that what they do? I don't even know if that's like the right hand motion or something. I have conquered the need to conquer the world. And Alexander the Great busted out laughing. He loved that answer, loved it, saluted the yogi, and then found another way around him. And he let them all be. One of the men that one of Alexander the Great's friends, Telamon, later after that scene, they were sitting on the bank of a river, and Telamon really admired these yogis. Telamon was a warrior for hire. He was a warrior his whole life. And he was at this transition stage in his life where he wanted to be done fighting and he wanted to become a sage. So Telamon said to Alexander the Great, he said, life is a battle, is it not? And how better to train for it than to be a soldier? For have you not noticed of these sages that they are the consummate soldiers? Inured to pain, to like used to it, like it doesn't bother them at all. Oblivious to hardship. Each takes up his post at dawn and does not relinquish it for thirst, hunger, heat, cold, fatigue. He's cheerful in all weathers, self-motivated, self-governed, self-commended. So here's this warrior saying, man, look at these warriors. Look at these men. And Alexander the Great said, hey, Telamon, are you saying that your training as a soldier prepares you for the life of a sage now? And Telamon said, nah, these men are beyond me. I would have to apprentice myself to them for many lifetimes. He's saying I could never be as wise or as strong as these men are. That's how much Telamon, the great warrior, with Alexander the Great, admired these yogis. I just want to emphasize, this is Alexander the stinking great we're talking about, not Alexander the okay. One of the greatest generals, warriors, leaders the world has ever known. He conquered the known world. And here's the key that Telamon, one of his best men, noticed, that you can conquer the world, but it's worth nothing if you don't have control over yourself. Here's what Telamon said. He said, the yogi's remarks that he has conquered the need to conquer the world could not be more apt. What the sage means is that he's mastered his daimon. That's we could translate that as demons today, like your personal demons. For what is the demon but that will to supremacy over others. Right? That's the demon that the world has. One of the sins of the world is that we need to supremacy over others, which resides not only in all men, but in beasts and even in plants, and is at its heart the curse and essence of all aggressive life. So the yogis have mastered the self, and they don't feel the need to supremacy over others. That's the story. Awesome story. You can go a million different directions. Here's my analogy relevant to today. The quest of a citizen of America used to be virtue, right? You wanted honor and virtue. Honor would be more the external praise, the external reputation. Virtue would be internal, like who you are. But the point is, you wanted to be good. And now we live in a culture where there's no such thing as honor. There's no honor, no shame, no God. And instead of that, we search for fame. Celebritydom is the highest good. Not virtue, not honor, but just fame. I would say that's one of the greatest demons of the modern world. It's fame. And more generally, the will to supremacy over others. We want to be thought of as supreme over others, that's fame. And we want to be supreme over others, that's power. And one way we do that in our social media world is to eviscerate people, right? We preen and we present ourselves perfect all the time with all this fakeness online, and then we try to eviscerate and obliterate the other side. The analogy to Alexander the Great is, as he's conquering the world, you can conquer social media. You can get 1 million followers. But then what? I'd rather focus on truth, deeper thought, self-control, rectifying the heart, to go back to Confucius, purifying the heart, mastering of the self. It's the line from Douglas MacArthur's poem. He wrote this poem when he was stationed in Australia, and his son was born, Arthur MacArthur. And it's this great poem called Prayers for My Son. And one of the lines is, he says, I pray for a son who will master himself before he seeks to master other men. We live in a culture today where people just seek to master other men and lord over other men without even attempting to master themselves first. And that's what social media and just our entire culture is today. It's all about mastering others, having a hotter take than others, getting more attention than others. And it looks good. It looks like it works, just like Alexander the Great. But he was never content. Either was Telamon. He admired the yogis even above what they were accomplishing as they were conquering the world. Pretty cool. So I say all that as a thank you. MikeSlater.locals.com is our answer against social media. It's the anti-social media. Please join us over there, MikeSlater.locals.com. And I want to thank you for watching this show as we focus on the things that really matter and the things that you can have control over, like what's coming up next, school choice, and the decision that you can make to best educate your kids, and not just to go with the flow and go along with the culture and send your kids to the broken public schools anymore. We have to make different choices, and we'll talk about that next. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. One of the most interesting things about the human experience is how tyranny is always pitched as liberation. And I guess it makes sense, right? No one would willingly follow the tyrant to be oppressed. So it's always pitched as, follow me and you'll be liberated. And there's a couple things, like a couple prerequisites that the tyrant needs to lay out there before that lie will work. So the first thing is, we're a pagan culture. That's the first point. John Adams, he said this. He says, we have no government armed. He means to say there's no such thing as a government that has the power capable of contending with human passions that are unbridled by morality and religion. So you have your human nature, and it's bad. You need morality and religion to bridle it, to rein it in. If not, no government can accomplish that. There's no government powerful enough, does not exist. Make sense? Avarice, greed, ambition, revenge would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Even the Constitution is not strong enough to keep back, to rein in these terrible emotions and aspects of human nature. It'd be like a whale through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Now, that's John Adams. Now, because the progressive idea has been to abandon God, we have to fill that with other things. And this has been the case for thousands of years. Paul wrote about this in Romans 1. He said, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God and give thanks to him. And they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. And here's the key. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the creator. We're designed to worship. If we don't worship God, then we end up worshiping the created over the creator. Makes sense? For the past how many years, the left has done everything it can to remove God and all biblical values from our culture. And we've replaced our worship. Instead of worshiping him, the creator, we've worshiped the created. Even the Pope recently said, nature is throwing a tantrum so that we will take care of her. What is this? Who is this goddess nature he's referring to? Nature, that's paganism. This partly explains the left's obsession with global warming, right? We're worshiping Mother Earth instead of God himself. A couple of examples, just the full-on cultural embrace of transgenderism is a very pagan thing. Right? The pagan gods back in the day, like the Roman and Greek gods, they could always change into things. The gods could change into people, they could change into animals, they could change into plants. They were always changing, right? We'll save transgenderism for another day, but another element of that is if you abandon God, then you start to accept the unholy trinity of me, myself, and I. That's what a lot of that's about too. And then of course abortion, and we'll talk about this another day as well, as Biden has already done a couple things regarding abortion, but there's gonna be many, many more things. I just happened to see this one yesterday. This is some popular OBGYN pro-abortion person who wrote on Twitter. There's a whole back and forth that doesn't really matter, but this person says it's Dr. Gunter to you. Someone just called her Gunter. It's Dr. Gunter. We're discussing a subject of my expertise. Again, this person's pro-abortion. The unborn are zombies. That doesn't apply here. Use medical terms or at least grown-up words. An embryo is a human embryo. It's not a human. We'll get to the zombie part in a second, but to say that an embryo is not a human is to say a toddler is not a human or a teenager is not a human. Embryo is merely the word that we use to describe a certain stage of human development. Just like infant. If I say that's an infant, you're not like infant human. You're like, no, it's my baby, like it's an infant. Clearly, infant just describes the stage of life that human is in, right? Newborn, toddler, senior citizen, whatever. Right? It's no matter what medical or social term you want to put on that stage of life, like adolescence, it's a human every time. Okay, that's the first thing about. Oh, it's not a human, it's an embryo. Like an embryo describes the stage of human development. Anyway, but then how about this? Zombie. It's a zombie? The unborn are zombies? Okay, doctor. So I don't know, when I think paganism, like one of the first things I think of is a child sacrifice. That's all pagan stuff. And then you throw populism on top of that, and critical race theory on top of that. That's not great. All right, so that's like the first prereq. This is Rod Dreher. Rod Dreher, who I enjoy very much, he was quoting Cardinal Mueller. The backstory doesn't matter that much. Here's Rod Dreher. He says, all the major power holders in the United States are equally committed to creating a world in which all are liberated from the chains of tradition, religion, biology, transgenderism, of history, of national feeling, and are turned into a herd of consuming individuals, materialist consuming individuals, eager to be controlled by elites. They want Brave New World. Quick little plug for Brave New World. Everyone's quoting, and rightfully so, George Orwell's 1984. It's Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which is much closer to what we're living in today. Anyway, we're always being liberated from oppression. That's how it's always pitched. You need to be liberated from biology, liberated from tradition, liberated from religion. Right? We're always being liberated. People fall for it, and they walk right into actual oppression. My radio show on last Friday, we talked to this author about feminism. And this is a perfect example. Women have been lied to for 50 plus years, and there were two lies. The first lie was that men live amazing, exciting lives. Men go out in the corporate world and they are fulfilled by their career. And women, you are really missing out. You are really missing out on something special. The second lie is, oh, women, the drudgery of being a housewife. It's miserable and unbearable, and it's chattel slavery. You need to liberate yourself from womanhood and be more like a man. It's maybe one of the biggest lies ever told, right? In reality, the pitch was, women, stop being chained down by the security and love and adoration and the amazing blessing of being a wife and mother. Liberate yourself from that so that you can participate in the soulless, mindless drudgery of the corporate world. All done in the name of liberation. But that's what the liar, that's what they have to do. That's the lie they have to tell to pitch liberation, right? They have to make the past seem awful and seem like something you need to be liberated from. And they need to make the alternative seem amazing to be something that you need to be liberated to. Make sense? Solzhenitsyn, he wrote this. He said, denigrating the past is deemed to be the key to progress. And so it has once again become fashionable in Russia to ridicule, debunk, and toss overboard the great Russian literature, steeped as it is in love and compassion towards all human beings, and especially towards those who suffer, right? You need to ridicule, debunk, and toss overboard the truths of what life really is and could be. Louis Marcos, he said that Solzhenitsyn understood that no stable future can be built on hatred of the past, because hatred of the past inevitably leads to hatred of your society today, of your neighbor, and even possibly to yourself. It's a terrible thing that our kids today are told, and we all are told, to hate America, hate our past. There's schools in San Francisco that are changing the name of the schools. Abraham Lincoln and George Washington high schools. They're getting rid of the, right, because Lincoln and Washington are too controversial, okay? You can't build a good future on hatred of the past. So be careful when people characterize the past in certain ways, certain terrible, horrible, awful ways. Be careful when you hear calls for utopia in the future, just follow me. Be cautious when you hear cries of liberation. It's usually the exact opposite. True story, Mike Slater. We'll come back, talk about school choice. By the way. Hey, Slater Crusaders. So the first segment of the show, we talked about doing the things that are within your control, right? Focusing on those things. And one of the most important things that's in your control is the education of your children. And I hope throughout COVID, if nothing else, we've realized that it is possible for you to do other things other than just send your kids mindlessly to the public schools. And I hope it's so obvious how toxic and terrible the public school is to your child's brain and soul in so many different ways. We've talked about it a million times, but I want to go to someone who's just on the forefront of this, fighting for school choice, has been doing an amazing job reporting on all the wonderful and hopeful efforts that have been happening across the country. It's Corey DeAngelis. He's the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation and the executive director of the Educational Freedom Institute. Corey, how are you, brother?
Hey, doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, I am very, very frustrated at Republicans, and that's why I want you here to give me some hope that they have not used COVID as the ultimate opportunity to usher in school choice. If we can't usher in school choice when the schools are closed for a year, then what other opportunity will we ever have to do it? But you say there is some good news.
Yeah, and this is the once in a lifetime opportunity here. There are legislators in at least 15 states that I've been tracking over at the Educational Freedom Institute that have introduced bills to fund students instead of systems. And look, the teachers unions pretty much overplayed their hand this year. They've done more to advance school choice than anyone could have ever imagined because they've kept the schools closed, or at least fought to keep the schools closed for in-person instruction for a very long time, whereas the private schools have been fighting for the opposite. They've either been open for a long time or they've been fighting against governments to try to reopen in order to meet the needs of their customers, because they know, at least the private schools know, that their customers can take their money elsewhere. So there are at least 15 states now with this type of legislation that's introduced. Some states have better outlooks than others, but look, support for school choice is skyrocketing right now. If you look at the latest Real Clear Opinion national polling on this, support for school choice in just a couple of months increased by 10 percentage points from 67% in April 2020 to 77% in August 2020. So parents are fired up, and it's because the public school system just hasn't been there for them this year.
No, 77%, that's amazing. And I just want to emphasize that this is not a new idea. Milton Friedman's been fighting for this since the 70s. I know he's the head at the top of your Twitter profile. This has been decades and decades in the making. So goodness, let's make it happen. Do you have the 15 states off the top of your head, or at least a bunch of them in case we have people in those states listening right now?
Recall a couple of them. New Hampshire, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Arkansas just introduced a bill yesterday, Georgia. So there's a bunch of these types of states. There are some states where that bills have been introduced, but it's not as likely to occur, such as Washington State and Oregon, for example. It's just because of the legislative makeup in those particular states, it seems a lot less likely to happen. But in places like New Hampshire, Iowa, Georgia, it seems like we might get something going there. And look, like I said before, I think the teachers unions really overplayed their hand here by keeping the schools closed for essentially as long as possible. I mean, look, in my area, in Fairfax County Public Schools, their teachers union president even was on record saying that she would oppose reopening schools full-time in person next fall, even if all of the teachers were vaccinated. So we're seeing this all around the country. The teachers unions have been kicking the can down the road every single step of the way. At this point, they've taken the goalposts and moved them out of the stadium, and families are fed up. They're scrambling. And look, they're turning to things like school choice. Look, if your grocery store doesn't reopen, you could take your money to another one. And families are thinking about it this way. They're saying, look, if our school doesn't reopen, we should be able to take our children's education dollars to another provider of the service that's more than happy to meet our children's needs, which tends to be the private schools. Or, hey, why not be able to take some of that money to cover the cost of home-based education? And that's what we're seeing in these legislatures all across the nation right now.
I want to ask you specifically what these bills look like, but just to wrap up the teachers union, what's their play here? Am I cynical to believe it's just that we're going to keep kids out of school so we can get more money?
Well, look, if you're just thinking rational cost-benefit decision-making standpoint, in the short run, you can keep your benefits about the same in terms of job security and pay, and you can minimize any costs whatsoever, even if they're very low in terms of risk of going to school in person, commute times, and then just having to provide the childcare activities in person. And so from that standpoint, it kind of rationally makes sense to keep the schools closed if you know that you can get paid either way. But I'm saying that I think they're not calculating the long-term effects of this, because look, families are flocking the public school system even without school choice mechanisms right now. All across the nation, we've seen states lose, the traditional public schools lose between 3 to 5% of their population, and that's a lot of money tied to each student. And then also, look, families are really excited about school choice right now, and they're pushing for things like education savings accounts. And that could do real harm to the teachers union in the long run. That's why I think they've overplayed their hand, and they're essentially providing free advertising for school choice.
Absolutely. And they're getting people to imagine that there's other options and other opportunities that could exist. And, I can do this homeschool thing, or which is good. So give us an example of what these bills tend to look like, or you can give one specific state. What does it mean?
Yeah, the majority of the states that have bills introduced this month or in the past month are something called education savings accounts. It's kind of like the Milton Friedman voucher idea, where if your public school doesn't work for whatever reason, by the way, you could still pick that if it does work, and that option should absolutely be on the table. But if not, you'd be able to take a voucher to pay for private school tuition and fees. But with the education savings accounts, the same kind of thing. A portion of those funds, instead of being in the form of a voucher, go into something called an education savings account for the individual child. And you could use that money for private school tuition and fees, but you could also use it for things like micro schools and pandemic pods and homeschooling options, and then also tutoring and textbooks and curriculum. So it really takes us from school choice to education choice and allows for maximum flexibility for the individual family to be able to customize their children's educational setting. You can use it for any government approved education expenditure.
How much money are we talking about in these accounts?
It's typically about half of what you would have gotten in the traditional public school system. So let's say you spent, $10,000 in the traditional public schools, it would be about for $5,000, which goes a long way towards paying for all these alternative types of educational expenditures. And that provides a benefit to the taxpayer. It provides a benefit to the public school because on a per pupil basis, they actually end up with more money per pupil left behind. So they have an ability to adjust to this competition. And so it really creates a win-win-win situation. The families win, the public schools win by getting to keep some of the money, the taxpayer wins. The only people that don't win are the teachers' unions, which don't have the same incentives as the individual teachers in the system.
Yeah, this is interesting, the fact that the parent gets half as much money, right? So ideally, you'd want it to be the whole thing. But you're right, to pipe down the public school advocates, so let's say I'm in the public school system, all right, my kid. So that's $10,000. It's probably more for most places. Let's say $10,000 goes to the public school. My kid leaves, all right, I want to go to this private school over here. I get $5,000, and $5,000 still stays with the school, even though there's no kid there anymore.
Yeah, it either stays with it usually stays, it gets split up between the taxpayer and the individual school district. So there are benefits to the state taxpayer, then there are also benefits to the individual school district. It depends on your funding formula in the state, but you're right, they do get to keep a lot of money. Just imagine if you left Walmart and started shopping at Trader Joe's and Walmart got to keep 20 to 50% of your grocery bill each week. They'd be really happy with that deal. It's a good deal for Walmart. And I argue it's a good deal for the public schools to get to keep any money at all for students they're no longer educating. So when they say that school choice is defunding the public schools, my response is, well, you get to keep a lot of the money. You actually end up financially better off on a per pupil basis. And the money doesn't belong to you in the first place. The money belongs to the child. Education funding is meant for educating children, not for protecting a particular institution. But like we said, the reality on the ground to get these things passed, you had to create benefits for individual actors in the system. And
yeah, that's right. Unfortunately, that's right. All right, let me give you the counter. So the counter is, okay, we got 100 kids in this school. Some are high performing, some medium, some low. You provide this voucher system. All the high performing kids are going to leave. A couple of the medium performing kids are going to leave, and you're going to be left with an educational ghetto of the lowest performing kids. And everyone will suffer because of that. Because whatever, there's no role models. There's no, I don't even know, right? There's no high performing kids there to lift all boats or something. So what do you say about that?
This argument assumes that we have equity in the traditional public school system, which we don't at all. The most advantaged already have school choice in the traditional system. The most advantaged in society are more likely to be able to afford a home in a higher income neighborhood that happens to be residentially assigned to the best public schools in the area. And more advantaged already have the money to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. So school choice initiatives like education savings accounts actually lead to more equity by allowing less advantaged families to have similar types of options, because let's face it, the most advantaged already have school choice. And then my other response to that is there are 28 studies on this topic, and 26 of the 28 existing studies on this topic find that school choice competition, either for private schools or other mechanisms, lead to better outcomes in the traditional public school system because of competitive pressures. The public schools start to scratch their heads a little bit and realize that, well, if we don't want to lose any of the money associated with those children, maybe we should cater to the needs of the families. And so they start to allocate resources more efficiently. They start to put more of those resources into the classroom instead of towards things like administrative bloat and surges in support staff, which is beneficial for the individual students. It's good for the teachers. 5 studies find that school choice competition leads to higher teacher salaries in the public school system. And again, that's because it gives their employer a better incentive to spend that money wisely. And the best way to spend that money is in the classroom on the teachers.
Okay, I agree with that. In 1 minute, let me give you another counter. We've had generations of no school choice, really. So you have parents, they're usually going to be low-income parents who can't even imagine other opportunities that are out there. So yeah, you may be offering them this other option, but they're not, I mean, it's such an insulting argument, but this is the argument they make. They're not smart enough, they don't care enough, they're not involved enough in their kids' education to take advantage of those.
This argument is the last chapter of School Choice Myths, Setting the Record Straight on Education Freedom. It's by Virginia Walden Ford, who's also featured in the movie on Netflix, Miss Virginia. I recommend going and checking out that video as well. But look, families from all different types of backgrounds and situations in general have more information and incentive to get the decision right for their own children's education than do bureaucrats sitting in offices hundreds of miles away. So the families are more likely to get it right. The bureaucrats make decisions incorrectly. The public schools mess up all the time. I'd rather trust parents from all different types of background and situations. Then also there's a study by Cornell researchers from 2018, peer-reviewed and published, finding that when you get more school choice, families actually start to research educational options more. And so this really helps build the family unit as well, because it gives them more confidence. It gives them more hope for their children's life trajectory. So they actually start to look at these options and become more involved with their family.
Of course, because for generations, there's been no other options, and now there finally is. So of course they would start to look more. Corey, you're the man. Please keep up the wonderful work. Give my best to everyone you're working with and everyone at the whole team. Director of School Choice at the Reason Foundation and Executive Director of the Educational Freedom Institute. Thanks, Corey.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Super, super encouraging. Love that. All right, coming up next with the hate speech code, the National Association of Realtors, silencing speech. Coming up next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. So every day, there's new stories of cancel culture everywhere. The craziest stories, they get crazier every single day. This is probably the biggest ethics code and most invasive ethics code of any organizations yet. And we need to know about this because it's only going to spread. John Morawski, he is from Real Clear Investigations. John, how are you, sir?
Hey, I'm doing fine.
Thanks for being here. Tell us what the new ethics code is for the National Association of Realtors.
Yeah, the National Association of Realtors is the largest trade group and membership organization in the country. It may even be in the world, unless the Communist Party in China may be bigger, I guess. But speaking, of the real world here, they have 1.4 million members, and they passed a ethics code that governs your speech in your private life. So it's not normally within any kind of organization. The ethics code applies to what you do at work, but this actually applies what you do off the clock. And it's a hate speech code, and it bans hate speech off the clock as well as on the clock too. So it's 24/7, and it is there's 1.4 million members, and so it affects a huge amount of people. And because the national so influential and so large, some people think that ultimately this will be accepted as a best practice in the professional world, and lots of companies will, or lots of organizations and companies will begin adopting things like this because they're under intense pressure to control their employees and prevent hate speech.
Yep, that's
hate
definitely right.
Speech is very vaguely defined, so that's the problem here is they don't really define it.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, what is hate speech and harassing speech? And do we have any examples of this policy being executed yet?
We don't know if it's being executed because it's all would be executed at the local level, at local, state, and county NAR branches, and they don't have to report to the national organization. There could have already been 100 investigations, and we wouldn't know about them, and NAR wouldn't even know about them. There is no reporting mechanism, so it all happens locally. And hate speech it's harassing speech, it's intimidating speech, it's offensive speech, it's slurs and epithets. So it's everything you would think of as hate speech, but it also could be broader because it's somewhat subjective. So we know, for example, this summer, employees were fired because they posted online, "All lives matter." To some people, to say "all lives matter" is the equivalent of saying KKK. I mean, it is deeply offensive and it really upsets them. For other people, it's just a generic statement. It's like saying milk is white, So there's these differences of opinion as to what is hate speech. And these local hearing panels are going to have to decide. They have guidelines, and they do have they have some standards. So they had a meeting on January 14th. The most common question that comes up is, if I'm a Christian and I'm teaching Sunday school, or I'm actually in the pulpit, and I say that homosexuality is a sin, can I do that, or is that hate speech? So they actually said on a January 14th training session, they basically said, you can say it generically. You can say, according to the teachings of our religion and our scriptures, marriage is between a man and a woman, and homosexuality is regarded as not within the confines of marriage. What you can't do is you can't say you put in the epithet there, all blanks are going to hell. You can't say that. In real life, what happens is people are somewhere in the middle. They are a little more aggressive than just saying, a kind of bland statement. According to our religion, it is, they usually say something more emotional. They may not go as far as the Westboro Baptist Church and say, you're all burning in hell. You're all barbecued. They're not going to go that far, but they're going to say there's a middle ground there. And that's where these hearing panels are going to have to make a decision based on the facts pertinent to that case, based on what they think the intentions are of the speaker at that moment. So it can get very subjective, and it does, encroach into your life as a religious person or as a person, and your private conscience. So that's, in these large organizations.
It's interesting because people are worried about like the government cracking down on freedom of speech, and I don't even know how much the government needs to. Because there's armies of the National Association of Realtors, local boards, who are doing all the chilling and silencing necessary. The government may not even need to get involved.
Increasingly, our social norms are being policed or monitored by private organizations like employers, universities, to some degree, school systems, although they're not private, they're government, but private schools definitely are even more aggressive in this than public schools. And so as a condition of your employment, you have to conform to certain social norms. Now, that's always been the case. The way you dress, the way you behave is always, to some degree, you don't have 100% freedom, but there's been a very rapid and dramatic change. And it's crossed into these areas of where previously these organizations weren't involved. And so it creates a culture shock because people aren't used to it. And we may all end up getting used to it, and we may find a middle ground where we all agree how to behave and things work out for everybody. But during the adjustment process, there's a certain shock and some people will lose their jobs.
No, it's a problem. I'm thinking, so it's Black History Month, as we're being reminded everywhere you turn. And I know San Diego Unified, where I live, but also LA Unified, they're doing a ton with queer, trans, and something other, black, whatever. And if I were a realtor and I would say even something, I think something as benign as, hey, I thought it was Black History Month, not trans Black History, or something like that. I could imagine the National Association, someone complaining, and I have to go in front of the board of the National Association of Realtors, and I lose my job because I made a very genuine question of, this is different, this is odd, and people aren't going to speak.
So, it doesn't mean that every complaint is going to result in some kind of finding of wrongdoing, but what it does mean is that you may have to hire a lawyer, and you have to show up, come up with produce evidence, answer questions, and spend a considerable amount of your time defending yourself. So you could be found completely innocent, essentially. You could be acquitted, but it could be stressful. So we shouldn't assume that every complaint will get you, will result in a finding of wrongdoing. And every finding of wrongdoing is not going to lose your job. You just may be fined $100, or you may have to do, anti-bias training. So, and it's not really a question of losing your.
Sure, totally. I imagine a silencing. Silencing to prevent that process from going forward. And I imagine it would look a lot like the campus tribunals, where you're guilty until proven innocent, which is obviously not how it normally goes, but it would go in something like this, I imagine. What is the penalty? What's the top penalty? Did they include anything?
$15,000 and expulsion from the National Association of Realtors and a $15,000 fine. And if you get kicked out of NAR, you don't lose your license because they don't issue the license. The license is issued by the state authority.
Okay.
But what it does mean for a lot of people is you don't have access to the multiple listing service. And the multiple listing service is the online data searchable database. So you really can't do your job. So you really need to be staying on.
Yeah, totally. What do you think is motivating this from the National Association of Realtors? I may be making this up, but I feel like there's probably a little bit of extra guilt or overcompensating perhaps because of redlining, right? I know that's one of the main Black Lives Matter's critiques of racism in our past. So do you think there's a little bit of like, we're trying to CYA from the NAR?
They're trying to, in fact, they've said on multiple occasions, 6 days after they passed this standard, they issued a public apology for their role in systemic racism in the 20th century, which was redlining, which basically prevented Black people from limited where Black people could live, and it forced and it reduced, artificially suppressed the real estate values where Black people do live. And that is, in the social justice world, that's connected to gentrification because the artificially depressed property values means that white predators can then move in and buy all. That's the way systemic racism works in the social justice model. So they are concerned about the history of redlining and their role in it because they actually were involved in all that. They were participants and willing participants.
Yeah.
And so they were enforcing these things. Yeah, and they now feel like they have a special duty to make things right.
Yeah, and you're right, though. This is going to become best practice for all these big organizations. That's the real problem, even if you're not in the National Association of Realtors. John Morawski, Real Clear Investigations. Thank you for investigating, John. Please keep us up to date on, I'm sure eventually, I hope eventually we'll hear stories of people actually, well, I don't want people to get fired, but I hope we hear the stories of the people who do get fired because of this, and we can tell those stories as well.
Yeah, some of them may end up, they may end up litigated, and that's how we would hear about it.
Yeah, beautiful. John, thanks for your help. Appreciate you.
Thanks
really
very
good.
much.
All right, have a wonderful day. We'll do it again tomorrow. True story, Mike Slater, MikeSlater.locals.com. Spread the word.